talking about are grouped into three. I put them into three groups. I'm going to talk about people who are monarchs, that is, people who are queens and ruled over a certain amount of area. To be a queen, in my definition here, you have to rule over something, not be a consort to a husband, but have your own independent rule. And then we're going to look at some women who were mystics in the Middle Ages, and then go to some people I've called misfits. They're not really misfits, but there's no category exactly to put them into. So they're just women who did some really amazing things, but they don't kind of quite fit in a category. That some of them actually could be considered writers for their time period, but they're a variety anyway of women. So let me start with the first one. The first woman I want to talk about is a woman named Hatshepsut. She's in Egypt in the 16th and into the 15th century, and that is what we now are it used to be called BC, and now it's before the Common Era. So she's in that ancient really period of Egypt. She follows the traditional Egypt. Ruling families always married their half brothers. So she marries a gentleman by the name of Thutmose II, who was her half brother when she was quite young. He dies about 7 years into the marriage, and she then serves as regent for her stepson, Thutmose III. But about 1489, which is about 30 years into her rule, she decides to rule on her own. And so she declares herself king and not regent anymore. And unfortunately, again, we don't have the slides, but if you were to see a statue of her, particularly a standing statue, you would note that she wears a headdress of a pharaoh, a male pharaoh, that she will wear a beard that male pharaohs did, and she puts on all the garb as though she were a male pharaoh. She also was responsible for some of the building projects in the Luxor Valley, and also she built a mausoleum for herself, which has been considered a masterpiece in ancient architecture. And then I want to mention to you Nefertiti, because everybody knows Nefertiti. They've seen her picture, the bust of her. Nefertiti, by the way, means beautiful companion. She was the wife of a pharaoh named Akhenaten, and Akhenaten was one of the people who changed Egypt by deciding that they were going to worship only one god and not the multiple gods that they had been worshiping, and that they were only going to worship the god Ra. This meant that all of the thank you. Thank you. This meant that all of the other temples that were for all the other gods got closed down. All of those priests got fired. It was not something that made a lot of people happy in Egypt, but he did it anyway. And then when he passed away, she continued the process until she just disappears. Nobody knows quite what happened to her, but suddenly she's no longer in the record. There's no place that records where she was buried either. But she was followed by the now very famous Tutankhamun, because everybody knows about him because of all of the gold that we get to see when his tomb is on display. And then I want to talk for a minute about someone who perhaps is a little bit less known, and that is the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba, and we actually don't have, I had a painting that was done in the 19th century of her, but she made a visit to King Solomon, and you can find the story of this visit in both the Quran and in the Hebrew Bible. So it is not, and in the Ethiopian early text in Ethiopia too. Both of those are places where Okay, that's actually from my okay. Anyway, this is she visiting. This is done by Pointer in the 1890 gallery of the in New South Wales. Um, it is it's the one I was intending to show. So thank you, Rachel. Anyway, she's in all three of those sources, but only in the Quran and the Egyptians, the Ethiopian source is she actually named. The Hebrew Bible doesn't give her a name. Um, and of course, there's great debate about where Sheba really was because it doesn't exist anymore. There are two choices, basically Yemen or the Ethiopian Peninsula. Most of the sources favor Yemen, but I sort of think it might have been Ethiopia because she was in this early uh, uh, epic poem of the coming of Ethiopia, and her name is mentioned as Makata there, and she does say that she made a journey to Israel. She brought Solomon gold, spices, gems, which are also very likely because they come from the area of really from Africa. And they usually were taken across to the Arabian Peninsula, but they could have come from the Arabian Peninsula. Anyway, she takes them to Solomon with the intent that Solomon is going to be a gift or a reward to Solomon for sharing his wisdom with her. There is a story that Solomon seduced her and was the father of her son, but there is no evidence to that. Although she did have a son, and the Ethiopians claim that his name was Mennebec, that he was the beginning of the line of kings that continued until Haile Selassie was deposed in the mid-20th century. So they sort of believe that Solomon may have done that, but there's no proof for that. Now let's talk about Cleopatra, because everybody has to talk about Cleopatra. Cleopatra initially began to rule when she was 21 years old. And again, she ruled with a stepbrother who was only 13. The courtiers decide that they want him because they can manipulate him, so they get rid of her. They send her into exile. So Cleopatra goes into exile. And in the meantime, there is dissension in the country, and Julius Caesar, who is the consul, comes across the Mediterranean to Egypt because Egypt is dependent. I mean, Rome is dependent on Egypt for grain, so he doesn't want any of these difficulties occurring in Egypt. And he comes across with the idea that he's going to meet with both Ptolemy and Ptolemy the 13th, who is her stepbrother, and Cleopatra. But Cleopatra's in exile, and she doesn't want to come back. So she's afraid she's going to get captured by these courtiers, and so she has herself delivered to Caesar in a rug, because she couldn't openly return to Egypt. And he was immediately attracted to her, and as a result, restored her as the Egyptian queen. Christian Meyer, who wrote a biography of Julius Caesar, described her as having been, quote, having a bewitching manner and radiated irresistible fascination that made everybody spellbound. End of the quote. The relationship between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra produced a son named Caesarion, and both she and Caesarion accompanied Julius Caesar back to Rome after and she stayed in 45 BC, and she stayed there until Caesar was assassinated in 44 when they returned to Egypt. And then 3 years later is when she meets Mark Antony, and she meets him again. She's on the Anatolian Peninsula in Tarsus. They go back to Egypt, spend the winter together, and she produces twins for Mark Antony. While he was in Egypt, he helped restore the territory of Cyrene in the Mediterranean into Egypt. In return, he pledged Egypt's support to him in 34. Mark Antony declares Caesarion to be the real heir to the Roman Empire. And obviously he does that because he I think Cleopatra think they're going to, be able to take over the Roman Empire. Well, Octavian doesn't allow that to happen. Octavian and Mark Antony go to war with each other. Mark Antony is defeated at the Battle of Actium, and he and Cleopatra commit suicide. And just as an aside here, there have been 29 movies made in which Cleopatra was the main or supporting character. The most famous of them is the one that you're looking at now on the screen, which is the one that was made in 1963 with with Elizabeth Taylor starring as Cleopatra. Harold Bloom, who is the expert on everything Shakespearean, says of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra that Shakespeare has his own interpretation of her life, but he says of Shakespearean interpretation of women, Cleopatra is the most subtle and the most formidable. So, but Cleopatra, the many lives of Cleopatra are right up to there. Then from there, we're going to go up to England and look at a woman whose name is Boadicea, or she has, it can be spelled a zillion different ways. Okay, but Boadicea is the one we're going to use. She was the queen of the Iceni, which was a tribe up, if you're kind of familiar with the map of England, it's north of London by a couple hundred miles toward the North Sea. And she was the queen. Well, her husband made a treaty with the Romans because the Romans had just started to occupy. Oh, yes, hold that scene. The Romans had just started to occupy the British, well, to occupy England. And in the process of trying to take over it, they made a treaty with her husband, Protesilaus, that when he died, they would get a portion of the land that he controlled as sort of head of this tribe. He dies unexpectedly. The Romans, in their inimitable way, decide they're going to take all of what he has and not just the piece that he promised them. And she objects to that. She gets beaten up. Her daughters get raped, and she gets really angry. And when she gets really angry, she goes out and she goes to all the other tribes and puts together an army. And the army actually then attacks the British cities of Colchester, St. Albans, and London and burn them to the ground. It's believed that they killed about 70,000 either Romans or Roman sympathizers, including wiping out a whole Roman legion. Before the Romans regroup, and once they regroup, of course, they get rid of all of these people, and she, in despair, commits suicide. And you see on the scene on the slide that is a statue that has been put up in London on Westminster Bridge. And Manda Scott, who is a contemporary British author, has written that that Boadicea is the only woman in the world who has a statue erected in her honor in the middle of a city that she burned to ashes. And I think that's probably pretty accurate. Let's then talk about another English queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled the Duchy of Aquitaine. She didn't get to rule France exactly, but she does get to rule. She always maintains control over the duchy, which she inherited from her father in 1137. She was actually born in 1122. She is married to both a king of France and a king of England. She married the king of France first, and while she was married to him, she went with him on the Second Crusade. And getting ready to go on that crusade, she actually is able to put together a company of women to go with her, and they were known as the Queen's Guard. And soon after they returned, she and Louis returned from this. Louis VII. They returned from this from the crusade. Their marriage was annulled on the grounds that they were fourth cousins. Basically, the marriage was annulled because they, first of all, didn't really get along. They really were very different people. And second of all, she had only produced two girls for him and not an heir. And thirdly, she was already married, already in love with the King of England. So for all of those reasons, there is the marriage came to an end. The official reason, though, is that they were cousins. A better reason, as I said, was all of those things. She then married Henry II, who's the King of England. He was 12 years younger than she was. It didn't seem to matter. They had 8 children, and their first 3 children were boys. The only 2 of them become king. Richard, her third son, becomes king, and her youngest son, John, becomes kings of England. She effectively ruled England for about 4 years while Richard I was on the Third Crusade. On his way home from the crusade, Richard was captured and held for ransom. Eleanor traveled around England collecting the money to free him, which she then did. He was freed. And when he came home, she continued to advise him until he died in a battle in France where he got shot with an arrow, and then he got an infection, and since there was no way to cure an infection in the ancient days, he died. And she, at that point, she retires as well and turns everything over to John. And she spent the last 5 years of her life in a French convent, which she had endowed. And I just want to say that besides all the good things that she did for England, in her domain in Aquitaine, she supported the troubadour movement and turned Poitiers, which is the major city of the duchy, into a center for courtly love, poetry, and music. So she had a lot of influence outside of England as well as what she did in England. We are going to go back across all of the world and back to Africa now. Queen Amita, who lived from 1533 to 1610, was the queen of the Nazu kingdom, which is in what is today Nigeria. It was a Hassa kingdom. That is, it was one of several city-states that shared a common lineage, language, and culture. Despite that commonality, these states were often at war with each other. When she was 16, her mother became queen, and she was given the title heir apparent. However, she doesn't really get to be queen until her brother has been king and dies. But while her brother was king, she was in charge of the army. She led battles and controlled the whole army. Once she does become queen, she decides that she wants to enlarge the territory to provide better trade routes. So she is again back at war. She was known as a skilled marksman with a bow and arrow and an excellent military leader. And there is a picture of her. Anyway, not exactly, but anyway, she was known as I say, a skilled marksman and an excellent military leader. And what's interesting too is she purposely announced to everyone that she was never going to marry and she was never going to have children. So she was unusual in that respect. And to go to another queen who was also pretty much announced that she was never going to marry or have children, we're going to move back to England and look at Elizabeth I. I know everybody probably thinks they know a whole lot about her, so I'm not going to go into great detail of all the things that went on in her rule, but I do want to mention that she comes to the rule to be queen in 1558 after the death of her half-sister Mary. Mary has turned the country pretty much upside down by trying to return it to Roman Catholicism. Elizabeth doesn't do that. She returns to the religion that had emerged during the period of her father, Henry VIII, and her brother, Edward VI, which is what today we would call the Anglican Church. But she doesn't try to keep anybody from practicing whatever religion they wish to practice. She calls this kind of the middle way. She doesn't do that, but what it does by not restoring or continuing to restore Catholicism as Mary had tried, gets her in trouble with the Pope. And the Pope, who is actually Pius V, excommunicates her. And that sort of gives impetus to the Spanish to decide that they're going to invade England in the hopes of returning the country to Roman Catholicism. And they actually have in mind, because by now Mary, Queen of Scots, has been thrown out of Scotland and is living in sort of captivity, but under the protection of Elizabeth, but she's in captivity, and the Scots are working with her. Hopefully, if they can invade England, they can put her on the throne and restore the country to Roman Catholicism. That doesn't work out. The Armada is, as we all know, destroyed. And in the meantime, Elizabeth's people discover this plot that Mary, Queen of Scots, is involved in, and she is executed. And the order for her execution, Elizabeth has to sign. And, you know, she talks about this herself in some of the things that diaries kinds of things that she wrote, was an incredible, terrible experience for her, because Mary was actually a distant relative. She was also a queen. And Elizabeth signs her execution order and then promptly goes to bed for about 3 days in distress over the whole thing. Elizabeth's long reign brought peace and stability to England, politically and religiously, which, among other things, allowed the arts to flourish. At the end of her reign, Elizabeth gave the throne to Mary's son, James VI of Scotland. He became the next ruler of England, Ireland, and Scotland, benefiting greatly from the years of peace and prosperity she had created in England. Okay, so, all right, so now we're going to look at the mystics. And I'm going to start looking at the mystics are basically women, and I'm only doing 3, who are all in convents. And they're at 3 different ages. One is early on in the 11th, early into the 12th century, and then one is in the 14th into the 15th century, and then one actually is all in the 16th century. They are Hildegard of Bingen, Teresa of Avila, the latest one, and Julian of Norwich. And they're very different people. Hildegard was placed in a female convent and community that was attached to a Benedictine monastery in a place called Sobenburg in Germany, in what today we would call Germany anyway. And she, when she was 8 years old, it was not unusual for aristocratic families to do that, to put one of their children into religion, either as a priest or as a nun. She eventually becomes, about 20 years into her stay there, she becomes the abbess of the community. And a few years later, she decides it's time for them to split, because this convent had been controlled by the Benedictines, and she wants it to be independent. So she gets permission from the Bishop of Mainz and from the emperor, who is Frederick I, in the Holy Roman Empire at the time, to split it off, and rather for her to start her own convent, which is not one that's dependent on a male monastery, which is what she wants. So she founds one at Rupertsberg, and that Rupertsberg actually is near Bingen, which is where she gets the name Hildegard of Bingen. And so she gets help from all of these people, and then she founds a second convent. This is on one side of the Rhine, and she founds another one on the opposite side of the Rhine. She doesn't begin to start to write until she's 43. And because she had neither knowledge of early church fathers or any classical philosophy, she doesn't feel that she has the language to talk about the visions that she's had. And so she actually relies on scribes to put down her experience. And I think this is significant in a way, because this is going to be written in Latin. She isn't going to be writing. The next person we're going to talk about actually writes in English or early English, but we're 200 years from Julian of Norwich, who is the next person I'm going to talk about. And so in the 11th century, Hildegard is going to be writing in Latin, and probably she spoke it because she knew it from the Mass, but she didn't know how to write it. So her reliance on scribes to put down what she is saying. Now, she wrote a lot of things. She had a great deal of knowledge about natural health, and so she wrote 2 books on using nature for healing. She wrote a whole lot of music, songs that were put together in a group called the Symphonia. She, in her later life, she decided that she needed to go on preaching tours, as she felt that the clergy were not sufficiently learned to and needed support. Her tours were approved by the church hierarchy, but however, she may have thought all of that. She never really left the traditional notion. She didn't believe that women should be ordained to the priesthood. She felt that women could help out, but that they were not supposed to be in charge, if you were, although she was in charge of several convents. So we're going to move on to Julian of Norwich now. She wrote something called the Revelations of Divine Love, and she wrote it actually in 2 versions. She wrote it at one time, which was the short version, and then 15 years later sort of took that and made it the longer version. This is now we're in the 14th century. So she lives from 1342 to 1416. So now we've reached the period where people are writing in vernacular language. So she's actually writing in English, early English, the same English that Chaucer wrote in. In fact, it has been said that she ranked with Chaucer in the pioneering of an English prose, that, the spoken language is now getting put down on paper. And this is actually from the Norwich Cathedral, a statue of what we believe she actually looked like. It is so people, what she is what it was called an anchorite. She lived in a hut attached to a church, the St. Julian's Church in Norwich. It's not Norwich today. Norwich has a cathedral, but then they had a much smaller stone church, and she had a little hut that was attached to it. We don't know if her name was really Julian. We don't know anything about her early life, because she could write. We assume that she came from a upper class family, but there is really nothing about her early life that is at all known. But other than that, she has been ranked with Chaucer as a pioneer in English prose. So she did know how to write that language. One of the people who visited her is somebody we'll talk about a little later, Marjorie Kemp. And in Marjorie Kemp's writing, she talks about her experience visiting Julian and the kind of advice that Julian was giving. So he lived in this hut that was attached to the church, and people came to visit her. She obviously prayed a lot and probably had access to because the town of Norwich had other people of intellect there, so she probably had some access to things that she could read. But we don't know where she was before she came to become an anchorite there, and we kind of know when she may have died, but we do know that people who lived in that area will sometimes, when their diaries are found, there's a notation that donate to Julian, 2 pence or 2 shillings or something like that. So people are aware that she was supported by the community around her. But when she actually, the date of her death is 1416, but who she really was and how she lived is really somewhat of a mystery, other than the advice that she gave to people. And let's now talk about Teresa of Alba. Evola. That they slide that, and Rachel is doing a wonderful job creating slides out of nowhere here. But the slide that I had intended to show is Bernini, the great sculptor of the 18th century, did this wonderful piece of Saint Teresa in Ecstasy is the name of it, and it is in the Coronaro Chapel of the Church of Saint Maria del Vittorio in Rome. And there it is. There it is. This is so gorgeous. And Bernini did this, and it comes right out of her writing. She wrote a number of things, but one of them is that she wrote a description of her experience in a trance. And she had prayed herself into this trance and this dream that the angel came and pierced her with an arrow. She describes in one of her works, her most famous work is the interior castle, but there is a whole list of things. If you want to look, you can find a whole list. She wrote a number of things. And she wrote them herself, because by now we're into the 16th century, so people are in fact writing. So Saint Teresa, she's a Spanish mystic. She was a Carmelite nun and a religious reformer. She was elevated to the position of Doctor of the Church in 1970 by Pope Paul VI. And she is, I believe, the only woman that holds that position even today. She entered the convent when she was about 20 in 1535, and within 2 years she became seriously ill, and it took her about another 3 years to actually recover from that, and another maybe 10 or 12 years before she was able to pray in the way that she would later on, in that she would be able to go into these trances and have a spiritual awakening in them. She, as a result of her return to religious awakening in 1555, she decided that the Carmelites had become too worldly, and she wanted to move them back to a more austere way of living, which they had been before. So she does in the convent that she's in, and then she gets permission from the church to found a new convent called St. Joseph's. She works in tandem with a gentleman by the name of Julian de Lepes, a poet and mystic who later is known as St. John of the Cross. In total, she established 19 convents along the austere lines that she believed were correct. While establishing the convents, she found time to write. And I said before, the most famous of her works is the interior castle. Anyway, we have that, and that is the Bellini statue. This is a 17th century depiction of a woman in ecstasy. Okay, so that takes us out of the area of the mystics, and now we'll go to the people that I have sort of defined as misfits. And to do that, I'm going all the way back in time to the ancient Greeks, okay? The ancient Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta, in those city-states, women were treated somewhat differently. If you were in Athens, you were treated one way, in Sparta, something different. In Sparta, women were supposed to be strong to produce the men for the Spartan military. Thus, they were physically active and participants in the society. Athenian wives, on the other hand, were essentially secluded, as their daughters were, and their daughters' daughters, and so forth. So the further down you went in the ancestry, the less each one of these women knew about anything, because they never went anywhere or could do anything. The men of Athens, on the other hand, went to the market called the Agora, where they, as citizens, discussed the affairs of the day, did business, and brought home the groceries, as it were. There is little to be said about Athenian women. However, there are women in the eastern part of the Mediterranean that were not secluded and did interesting and creative things. And the one I want to bring to everyone's attention right now is a woman by the name of Sappho. Sappho was a poet who lived in the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. And she created and led an association called a Theos for young girls. These were sort of clubs, schools. It's hard to really describe exactly what they were, but they existed in cities all along the coast of Asia Minor and even in Sparta, but not in Athens. These were schools aristocratic girls attended, and they received kind of an education. But the learning really more emphasized music, singing, dancing. But it did give these girls a little opportunity away from home to develop their own personalities. And being that she wasn't in Athens, Sappho was free to write poetry that, according to one source, sang, quote, of rivalry and nostalgia, desperation and sweetness, all the feelings that accompany love. Many of her poems were addressed to girls when they were leaving the school to marry. Her work was known in Athens, where Plato referred to her as the 10th muse. Aristotle ranked her as equal to Homer. Much of her work has been lost. There is only one poem that we actually have in its entirety, and that is the Ode to Aphrodite. The rest are all fragments that have been sort of found on pieces of parchment here and there. She was not, however, the only woman poet. There was a woman named Meritis of Boeotia, who is said to have taught the poet Pindar, and Corinna of Tangera, who won 5 poetry victories over Pindar. So there were other women writing poetry, but Sappho seems to have been the one that wrote the best, or at least the most famous of those. 5th century Athens was a trading city. Merchants from all over the Mediterranean came there to sell or buy goods. Independent women, not necessarily Greek, came to Athens also. There, they took part in business and political affairs, which made them more interesting than the secluded wives who knew little about the affairs of the city. These women were known as hectaria, or translated, that means companion to men. They were often invited to symposia where the issues of the day, business and politics, were discussed. Pericles, the most politically powerful man in Athens, was often accompanied by his companion, whose name was Aspasia. And Socrates, a regular attendee at the symposia, regarded her as one of the most intelligent women he ever knew. We don't know much more about Aspasia. She did have a child with Pericles, a son, but they never married because the laws were such in Athens that it would not have benefited the child. So it was better that they didn't. Approximately 500 years earlier, now we're going to back even 500 years earlier than that, a woman named Delilah, who would have been called a hectaria if either the Philistines or the Hebrews had known the word, as she appears to have been lived an independent life, and was a companion to at least one man, Samson. Samson was a judge, which is kind of like a chief in the Hebrew world at the time, and as such had caused problems for the Philistines. They wished to get rid of him, actually, the Philistines did. They offered her money to find out the source of his strength, and so they could kill him, and she did. No doubt she needed the money to live. The question which haunts the Bible story is, how did she really feel about him? She eventually finds out that his long hair is the source of his strength, and she cuts it, or she has it cut. That's another question, allowing the Philistines to capture him. The story of Samson and Delilah, as told in the book of Judges, that's what I just sort of repeated to you in the Hebrew Bible, would have taken place somewhere around 1200 to 1000 before the Common Era, well before all the Greek city-states. I mean, actually, I included her because I wanted to talk a little bit about what happens to historical characters over time. We don't really know a lot about Delilah from the Bible story. So it's been left to kind of the imagination of people ever since to kind of put something more to the story. And depending on when that happens, how the story goes. So in the 16th, 17th century, John Milton, who was a Puritan and author of Paradise Lost, in England during Oliver Cromwell's rule, rewrote the story, and he titled it Samson Agonistes. And in it, Delilah is Samson's wife. She's not just an attachment, but she's still responsible for his fall. And once he's captured, she disappears because the story is really only about Samson. Handel will pick that up 100 years later, and he too is going to only make the story about Samson, or focus everything on Samson, and Delilah becomes a sub-player. And then you move forward to the 19th century and you get the Romantics, and Saint-Saëns actually gets a libretto from a gentleman by the name of Ferdinand Lemaire. And the opera that develops from that is a little bit different. There, Delilah has real character. Her character develops, and she has a major role in the action. Although she does still cut his hair, it's clear that she loves him. And that when she realizes what she has done, she, at the end of the opera, will die with him when the temple, when he pushes down the pillars and the temple falls. And the same is true with the Cecil B. DeMille movie, which was made in 1949, which the end has the same thing. The story is much about Samson, or as much about Delilah as it is about Samson. So in the movie, like the opera, she does die with Samson when the temple falls, but she has more character, and she changes and develops throughout the film, which is something that happens in more modern times. The woman, instead of just being dismissed for her evilness, she has character and she participates, and she can have redemption as well. Leaving the eastern part of the world, or the western part of the world, and going to the eastern part, we're going to go to Japan now. There is a woman in Japan in the 10th century whose name is Murasaki Shikibu, or maybe is her name. That may have been her court name, not her given born name. But anyway, the name by which we know her is Murasaki Shikibu. The reason we're talking about her is that she wrote probably what is the world's first novel. It's called The Tale of the Genji. She was writing in a period when Japanese was becoming a written language. So she too is a contributor to the creation of a language, a written language. The Japanese was a spoken language, but the Japanese had long before gone to the Chinese for their written language. And in fact, even at the time of Murasaki Shikibu, all of the court documents, all important documents, were written in Chinese, which women were not supposed to be able to read or write. And there was some question about whether she was an exception to that she may have been able to do that. Throughout much of her life, she kept a diary, and the diary is called The Diary of Lady Murasaki, which is available on Amazon if you want to read it. This is not necessarily unusual, as this was a form of writing open to women of the upper class. Her diary, however, tells a lot about the Heian court, which is where she was. The court was in this place called Heian, which is today the city of Kyoto. So if you wanted to look on the map of Japan, that would be where you would find out where she was. In 1185, the Heian court is going to be dissolved, and the court's going to move to a different city, and that's going to be the introduction of the samurai class. Samurais don't exist in the period of Lady Murasaki. So she writes about the court. So she is our insides of the working of the court life. The Tale of the Genji took about 10 years to complete. It's 1,100 pages long and is divided into 54 chapters, right? It also is available if you want to read it in translation on Amazon. Thematically, it is a tale of romantic love and human relationships. It isn't just the writing that set her apart from the women of her class and time, but the depth of her learning and the seriousness with which she took all of the tasks expected of her. As indicated in her diary, she was often out of patience with the frivolousness of court life. She wrote 128 poems, which are biographical in nature, and they are entitled poetic memoirs. She retired from the court in 1011 to live closer to nature and to practice Buddhism. The year of her death is disputed for a variety of reasons, which I'm not going to go into, but she could have died as early as 1014 or as late as 1025. Her daughter also wrote poetry, again under the name Diane no Samai. So she had at least had one child, and that child, we don't really know much about her personal life other than that. So now we're going back to England again to Marjorie Kemp. Marjorie Kemp lives now, we're going into the 14th into the 15th century. So leaping over time again. She's credited with what might be considered the first autobiography. So we've had, first novel. Now we can talk about first autobiography. And that there's been a recent kind of translation, because she is writing in English, but her English is English from the 14th century, so it isn't the English that you and I actually are speaking. So people have picked up her manuscript and have kind of translated it. You really need a lot of help if you're going to read it. So what I wanted to say is, so she really, and the other thing is, like all of the other women, she didn't actually write it. She probably didn't know how to write, but she dictated it. She was the daughter of a merchant in the town of Lynn, which is part of Norfolk, about 100 miles north of London. And that actually isn't far from Norwich, which is why she's able to go and eventually visit Julian of Norwich, which she does. When she was 20, she married John Kemp. It was after the birth of her first child that she became a vegetarian. She began to have visions, and she considered becoming celibate, and that doesn't really happen because she has 13 more children. It is interesting that only one of them is ever mentioned in the book that is her autobiography, and that is his son. And we don't know if he was the first child or where he fits into all of that. It was after she had the 14th child that she decided that she really had enough, and that she began her pilgrimages. And that's probably about 1413. She believed that she was given divine direction to go to Rome and to Jerusalem. It was on her return from the first pilgrimage that she went to Norwich to spoke to Julian. She made a second trip to Rome, and later she went to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where she stayed for about 14 days. There is one source I read, though, that suggested that some of these trips her husband may have gone, but the way they read in her autobiography, it sounds like she was pretty much by herself. She may have taken a maid with her, but it sounds more like she traveled alone than that anyone traveled with her. On more than one occasion, while she had these incredible bursts of crying also. She would be in the middle of a church service and the host would be raised and she would start to cry. And she had, besides the visions, she also had these outbursts. And they led the church to be concerned that she had not good spirits in her. And so she, on more than one occasion, was actually interrogated by one of the people higher hierarchy of the church to kind of to test whether these visions and crying scenes and so forth were legitimate, whether, or, were she being driven by some devil somewhere. She fell ill about 1418, and it's not clear why, but she tells us about it in her autobiography. And it lasted for a number of years. Her husband passes away in 1431, and sometime after that, also the son, the only one that she talks about, did as well. And then she travels to Danzig, which is today in Poland, but over on the coast there in Northern Europe. And it appears, again, it's not really clear in the autobiography, because sometimes her autobiography is so interesting because she never talks about herself. She calls this creature. She always refers to herself as this creature did something. This creature did something. She's always it's the third person the way she refers to herself. But she goes there, and it seems that she went there to bring her son's family back to England. But that isn't totally clear in her autobiography. She also, as I said, does not write this herself. She dictates that there are two different priests that she actually dictates it to. So there's, again, a question of her ability to write or knowledge about writing. But the last that we know about her is she's inducted into the Guild of the Holy Trinity in 1438, and there is a mention of her giving a donation in 1439. But when she died or where she's buried is a mystery. The travels are not actually what makes her unique. I think it's the writing and about herself that does. As the records for Rome, and when you, in this ancient time, when you went to like Rome or Jerusalem, there were sort of like there were hostels of a sort where you could stay, and they had books that you signed in with. And so we are aware that other women also made these journeys. She was not the only one to travel to some of these sites. And often the evidence in those books that they registered in suggests that they were alone. It's her book, her visions, and her crying spells that really set her apart from other women of her time. So let's go across the channel to France now and look at a woman by the name of Christine de Pizan, who lives in the end of the 14th and into the 15th century. She is actually contiguous with what was known as the 100 Years' War, a little piece of it anyway, although it does affect her. She's a French writer in the court of Charles VI. She grew up in the court of Charles V, however, who was known as Charles the Wise for the intelligent level of his court. His father was her father rather was an intellectual. He was a professor in the early universities. He was in Venice at the time. He was hired to be the court astrologer. It was a very important course. Many kings had astrologers at that point to sort of tell them what was going to happen by reading the stars. So after he had been in Paris for a year, he decided that he wanted to bring his family. He was going to stay. So he brought his family that were in Venice to Paris. And she was a young girl at the time. As a result, Christine had the benefit of all the literature and scholars that lived and worked in the court. At 15, she married a gentleman by the name of Etienne de Cassel, a clerk in the court. Charles, actually, a few years after she marries Etienne, Charles V actually dies. And Charles VI becomes the king, but he's too young to rule. So his uncles are regents. And with that, Christine's husband's position sort of changes a little bit, and certainly her father's does. About this same time, and then her father, very shortly after Charles V dies, her father dies. And by that time, he's kind of he's in poverty because he is no longer in the court, and he really can't make any money as an astrologer. And just 3 years after losing her father, her husband dies. He's on a trip for the king, and he goes into a city where there's some sort of plague, and he gets it, and he dies. So at 25, she is the sole support of her mother and 3 children, because they have nothing. Okay. The scholars researching her life and writings believe that her early writing was all poetry, and that mostly it was to allow herself to work through the difficulties of her life. In order to support her family, she worked as a copyist, and she found a job. In other words, she went to work as a copyist, and it was one of the few jobs that were open to women and also provided a good living. Later, when she leaves poetry and starts writing prose, she uses the skill that she learned when as a copyist in how to put a book together and how to get a book, in a sense, published, although we don't have a printing press yet. We're just a few years from the printing press. So it's all still copyists, but still books have to be bound and they have to, you want to sell them. So she learned about that. So she was quite good at getting the stuff that the prose writing that she does later all published and in the hands of people who wanted to read them. And it's clear that the experience of copying gave her skill and knowledge to produce the books that have made her famous. Several of her works are in defense of women. She also wrote a biography of Charles V. And again, Paris, okay, the Battle of Agincourt takes place. Then there's a treaty with the English in 1420, and Paris is kind of in upheaval. It doesn't know if it's French or it's English. And she eventually, about 1426, leaves Paris and goes to live in her daughter, one of her children, has gone into a convent, and she goes there, and that's where she spends the rest of her life. And she's there when Joan of Arc is able to free Orleans, as to be French about it, and she writes a poem in honor of Joan of Arc, which is still in existence today. So let's go and talk about Joan of Arc, because I know most of you probably know all about her, but I'm not going to go into all the gritty details, because her life is pretty well known, but I think she's worth mentioning in this point. She was known as the Maid of Orleans, as a result of visions from St. Margaret and St. Catherine. She believed she was called to help the French defeat the English and free the city of Orleans, which was under siege by the English, and with the help of the Burgundians in 1429. After she succeeded in leading the army to break the siege, she led the army and the Dauphin Charles to Rheims, where he was crowned Charles VII. The result of her efforts raised French national consciousness, giving the French the spirit that they needed to defeat the English and thus end the 100 Years' War, although it's going to take another 30 years to do that. Although she doesn't see victory, she was captured and tried for wearing men's clothes, which meant she was really a witch, and she's burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431. As far as anyone knows, Charles VII never made any attempt to negotiate her release, which is always something that has disappointed me, because I've always thought, come on, he should have been able to trade something for her. If she did all these good things for him, she should do something for her, but he didn't. He allowed, as they say, everything to play out as it did. Even today, she is considered a symbol of French nationalism. Marie Le Pen, the far-right political leader, has used her image in campaigning. In 1449, Charles, I think feeling a little guilty, decided to ask the Pope to have a new trial for Joan. Of course, she can't benefit from that, but she gets to have a new trial. The trial began in Paris but continued in Rouen. After the testimony of 115 witnesses, many of whom had been at the first trial, the former trial was declared flawed and was nullified. As they say, doesn't do her much good, though. But anyway, it was nullified. In May of 1920, Pope Benedict XV canonized her. There is a rock opera, which was premiered in 2022, which is called Born to Do This, which has as a subtitle, quote, "When a country needs a leader, one girl can do," end quote. So you can find I think you can find that rock opera if you go on YouTube. You can find almost anything on YouTube, but I think you can find that. I think this is Joan, this picture that you're seeing is Joan of Arc when she first goes to look for the king. And she doesn't quite know who the king is at that point. But let us move on to Isabel d'Este, okay, who is Italian and is considered the first lady of the Renaissance for her support of the artists such as Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Titian, and many other cultural and political figures. She was the Marchioness of Mantua as a result of her marriage to Francesco Gonzaga in 1490. He was obviously the Marquis of Mantua, and which is an independent area on the Italian peninsula near Venice. She had been betrothed to him since she was 6. I'm not sure how much older he was than she, by the way. I never found any dates for him. He was considered a military hero, and not as interested in the arts as she was. Although under her influence, he did become a patron. Her avid correspondence with many of the major figures of both art and politics has left us a women's perspective of Renaissance Italy. And one of these little interesting facts that I came across, her brother, who was the Duke of Ferrara, married Lucretia Borgia. Now, Lucretia Borgia was the illegitimate daughter of Pope Alexander VI. And if you may know anything about Lucretia Borgia, she had several husbands, and the Duke of Ferrara was her third. And once she moved into the family that includes Isabel d'Este, who welcomed her and then regretted welcoming her, because shortly after Lucretia met Isabel's husband, they started having an affair, which lasted for quite a long time, which I suspect did not make that a happy relationship. The whole Italian peninsula was kind of always in a lot of tension as well between the various states. There's one time when there's actually a war in the north, and the French invade and the Spanish invade. It's never a smooth moment in this period on the Italian peninsula. So in 1509, her husband Francesco gets captured. He's off doing some fighting somewhere, and he gets captured, and that leaves Isabella to govern Mantua, and she's very popular. The people really like her. In fact, her husband's a little jealous about that, and it takes her a number of years. It takes her about 5 years to get him back. She finally negotiates his release. He returns, but he is ill. One source I read said that he had syphilis. I don't know that's what he had, but anyway, he comes back and he's not well after having been in prison, and he dies in 1519. And since their son was not quite old enough to rule on his own, she governs Mantua until 1527. And in the course of that, she once has to organize the defense of Mantua against the French. When her son does take over, she moves to Rome, and she's there and invited to see the coronation of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was also King of Spain. So she travels in very high-end circles. For the last 10 years of her life, she is the ruler, I guess you could call her, of a small city-state called Salarolo, which had become part of the land inheritance of Mantua. One of the things that she is noted for, along with all the other things that I've already mentioned, is also that she was a leader in fashion. And I love this picture that Rachel has put up for you of her that was painted by Titian, because it does show her as all the fashion, the hair and the dress and so forth. And apparently her everything that she wore was copied by other people. So she was a leader of fashion as well as everything else. So we're going to leave her and we're going to talk about the last person that I have on my list here, and that is Artizima Giolesti, who was a Renaissance painter, woman Renaissance painter and she lived from 1593 to 1653. She was an artist in the latter part of the Renaissance. She was the first woman member of the Academy of De Arte. Her father, Orazio Giolesti, was a painter, and along with Agostino Tazzi, encouraged her talent. Tazzi rapes her at some point during his teaching her. And he then says he's going to marry her. Then he changes his mind and says he's not going to marry her. And so her father, Orazio, decides to sue him, not because she raped her, but because he dishonored the family by not marrying her. And there's an interesting piece that goes with this trial. So in the trial, in order to make sure that she was testifying correctly, she was actually tortured. She was actually was in thumb screws so that they would make sure she wasn't telling a lie when she said that she had been raped, although that wasn't the purpose of the trial. Shortly after the trial, her father arranges a marriage for her with a not so successful painter. And we don't hear much about him after that. By the time she was 18, her talent was totally recognized. After, as I said, after the trial was over, she had this arranged marriage with a painter whose name was Pier Antonio Stianhesi. They moved to Florence and gained patronage from the Medici. She had 5 children, only one of whom lived to be an adult. In 1620, she moved to Rome, and then in 1623, after 1623, there's no mention of her husband, so I don't know what happened to him. And that corresponds with the time, 1623, that her career really takes off. There is evidence of her living in Venice for a while and then in Naples. In 1638, she goes to England. Her father was there, and she and her father do some painting together of a ceiling for Charles I in England. She remains after her father dies in 1639 and does a number of portraits before she returns to Naples. I think, and the painting I most really wanted to show was her painting of Judith taking off the head of Holofernes. That painting shows you the technique that she liked. She wanted to follow the technique of Caravaggio. And Caravaggio believed in painting something in the instant it was happening. Like, he always said he wanted to paint eggs at the moment they solidified. And so this painting, thank you, Rachel, this painting, which shows Judith as the knife is just beginning to go across Holofernes' throat, and you can see the blood. It caused people were horrified by it because it was so realistic, and they didn't think a woman should be painting this. I mean, it really was. It caused a lot of stir, but it also, it was done early in her career. It was done in 1614, 16 to 18, but it certainly didn't hurt her career because her career went on beyond that. And I want to make note of, there is a painting by Artizima in the Wadsworth Athenaeum. It's entitled Self-Portrait as a Lute Player. She did a lot of self-portraits that almost all of her, where she paints just a single woman, like this one, the lute player. There's one of her as Saint Catherine. She uses her own face to do that. So if you want to see a painting by Artizima, you can just go to the Wadsworth, and I'm not sure where in the Wadsworth it is, but I'm sure they will direct you to it. I want to conclude with a comment. I can't show you the slide, but Judy Chicago in 1947, 1974, 79, did a huge art piece called The Dinner Party. And the dinner party is a triangle of a table. It is a triangle. And on it, there were 39 place settings. And they're very luxurious. And each of those place settings is for a woman of importance. And it is now oh, good. This is, you can see what it looks like. This is, and she each of these place settings is designed for the woman who's supposed to be sitting there. And there were 39 of them, in which the whole thing honors women of the past. One of the sides, and I think it may be the cross one at the end, is all Americans, but down the two sides are people from around the world. There are 39 elaborate place settings specifically designed memorializing a specific woman. So each one of these is different. Each one of the place settings is different, and it's different because it recognizes the individual who's supposed to be sitting at that particular place. Reason I show this to you for a couple of reasons. One is 8 of the women who are at that dinner table are in the list of women I talked about today. Hatshepsut, Boadicea, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, and Isabel d'Este, and of course, Artisma Kesalushi. I'm sorry, saying that really badly. But what I also want to say is that this work now is permanently in the Brooklyn Museum. There is now in the Brooklyn Museum. It was donated by I forget who now, but anyway, a woman with a lot of money donated this, and as I say, Elizabeth Sackler. Well, anyway, it's one of the Sacklers who donated it. I just remember. So she donated this whole thing to the Brooklyn Museum, and now they have a separate gallery that is just for women's art. And you can see, thank you, Rachel, you can see that each of these place settings is different. So it depends on what the woman did, what place setting, what the place settings look like. I have not seen this, but it is definitely on my list to do, to go to New York, to Brooklyn and see it. It's going to be permanently there. And along with that, it's a whole wing of the Brooklyn Museum that's now dedicated to women artists and to women. And so there is that ends. I end with this wonderful piece of art that is dedicated to women in Women's History Week.